I reviewed the HP EliteBook 840G5 5 months ago. Since then, this video has done over 13k views, over 150 likes, and over 50 comments. From the comments of this video, people kept asking for the best laptops for programming, graphics designing, and video editing, and if the HP EliteBook 840G5 actually does well when it comes to these three main points. In today's video, I'm not going to be talking about how well the HP EliteBook 840G5 has held up with these three main points, because that is an entirely separate video. Instead, I'll focus on guiding you to getting the best laptop for video editing, graphics designing, and programming. And in the end, I'll also give you some of my personal laptop recommendations for both PC users and Mac users. Whenever you're in the market to get a laptop, there are 5 major things I recommend you should check out if you want to do programming, video editing, or graphics designing on that laptop. Storage, display, processor, RAM, and GPU. When it comes to storage, you need a fast and large enough onboard storage to work with. There are 2 major types of storage you're going to deal with. We have HDD or hard disk drive and SSD, solid state drives. Hard disk drives are generally slower and cheaper per dollar when compared to SSDs. SSDs, on the other hand, are the ideal storage for modern laptops. They are faster, efficient, and per dollar when compared to HDD. If you're doing programming, I'll recommend you get at least a 256 gig SSD storage laptop. But if you'll be doing graphics designing or video editing, getting at least 500 or a terabyte or even higher SSD storage as the baseline on your laptop will be a wonderful choice. It's surprising as to how most people don't know this, but the display on most laptops are not the same. They vary from device to device. The most common ones are LCD, LED, and OLED for Windows laptops, and Apple's Liquid Retina display for MacBooks. If you're buying a laptop for programming, you shouldn't bother much about the display type, but if you're going to be working with color grading or tweaking around colors in a picture, or maybe just doing work that requires you to get the color right on a piece of media, you should pay close attention to the type of display. For my MacBook users, you shouldn't bother much because Apple's display are generally always great when it comes to color representation. For Windows users, you're now stuck between choosing LCD, LED, or OLED. I'll prefer or advise you to get an OLED display because of its superior image quality and durability. Also note that OLED screens will be more expensive than LED and LCD. And this also applies to external monitors, so take note if you're going to be getting one. Now, the processor is that component of your computer that does most of the work. It is what is responsible for carrying out the computer's tasks and performing operations. It's just like the brain of the computer. Processors are differentiated by their type and clock speed, which is a measure of how many instructions the processor can carry out per second. It can be written as 2.2 gigahertz, which simply means this processor's internal clock ticks 2.2 billion times per second. The catch here is the bigger the number, the better the processor. Okay, so let's begin with MacBooks. When Apple transitions from Intel-based chips to their silicon chips in 2020, the new chips became faster, efficient, and well optimized with apps on macOS. Their names are now easy to understand, compare, and remember. Apple M1 chip in 2020 was Apple's self-made chips, which was used on the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini, and the iMac in 2020. Other chips in the lineup include the Pro, the Max, which most people think should have been called Pro Max, just like their phones, and the Ultra, which is basically two M Maxes in one. One thing you should note is that these processors are not the same when it comes to performance, but the difference is not that big. The main difference is actually in the price, which most people think is a deal breaker. If you're going to be using your MacBook for coding, you shouldn't get a spec'd out MacBook Pro. You should consider just going in for the M1 MacBook Air from 2020. This laptop has held up quite a lot. Just look at the reviews of this laptop after 4 years. This basically tells you how good this laptop is. But if you're going to be doing some intense graphics work or intense video editing, you should at least go for the M2 MacBook Air for maybe just those average video editing and graphics work. But for a real intense work, a Pro MacBook would be better in the long run because they have the Pro chips in them. On the Windows side of things, the processor name and comparison becomes a little more complex. The two most common types of processors found on most Windows laptops are Intel and AMD. For Intel processors, you should look at one from Core i5 or higher for coding, but if you're going to be doing graphics work or video editing, you should consider a Core i7 or Core i9 processor. You should also take note of the letter at the end of the number in the processor name. U stands for ultra low power, which basically prioritizes battery power and portability over performance. Generally going to be like the slowest of them. We have P for power, which is going to be faster than the U, H for high performance, and G for graphics intensive work. So gamers should definitely go for the G model. For an AMD based processor, the Ryzen 5 would be good for programming, but if you were doing video editing or graphics designing, going with the Ryzen 7 or 9 HX would be a better value in the long run. Whether you're going in for Intel or AMD based processors, you should also look at the clock speed. For programmers, you should not go less than 2.2 GHz to 3.0, but for video editors and graphics designers, you should at least bump this up to like a 4.0 or higher for the clock speed. Trust me, it's going to come in handy. Let's talk about RAM, short for Random Access Memory, or simply memory. This is that unit of your computer that is responsible for how much data your computer can hold, or simply how many programs your computer can run simultaneously, which is good for multitasking. An 8 GB RAM is good for most programmers, but if you have the funds, you can go for a 16 gig model. For graphics designers and video editors, the baseline here is 16 GB. This is just the bare minimum. Trust me, this laptop I'm currently using has 16 GB, and sometimes Photoshop does terrible things to me. For video editors and graphics designers, you should go for a 16 or 32 GB or higher if you are able to afford it. Trust me, this is going to come in handy. For my coding folks, you shouldn't bother much about the GPU, the graphics processing unit. This unit of your computer is what is responsible for primarily accelerating, rendering, and processing images, videos, and animations. The gamers here understand what I'm trying to say, but I'm not going to go too detailed with the GPU specs because one, I'm not much of a gamer, and two, I don't know much about GPU specs. But if you're interested in learning about these things, I'll leave a couple of videos in the description for you to check them out and learn more. Now that you've known all the 5 major things you should consider when getting a laptop for programming, graphics designing, and video editing, how do you actually check these? On Windows, all you have to do is press the Ctrl, Shift, and Escape key to open the Task Manager. Click on the Performance section. You can click on CPU to check your processor, memory for the RAM, disk for the storage, and GPU for the graphics processing unit. For the display of your monitor, you can check out the product details of the laptop you're going to buy on the internet. For my Mac users, all you have to do is click on the Apple menu, then click on About this Mac. Note that on MacBooks, the M chips use a unified memory architecture, which basically means the RAM, the GPU memory, and cache are combined into a single pool. Don't be afraid, because these MacBook chips are actually more efficient than their Windows counterparts. Most people even argue that a 16GB RAM on a MacBook is equivalent or even better than a 32GB RAM on a Windows PC. Do you agree with this argument? Tell me down in the comment section. Okay, so one thing I didn't mention was battery power, because it was not one of my major points to getting a laptop for programming, graphics designing, or video editing. The reason is because most laptops these days, except for MacBooks, don't max out the laptop's performance on battery power. So if you want to use your laptop to the full performance capacity, you definitely have to plug it in. Now, don't get me wrong, a laptop with a long-lasting battery is good, but what I'm actually recommending laptops for is programming, graphics designing, and video editing. And here, performance is the ideal thing, and most laptops don't do performance justice when it comes to using it on battery power. So that is the main reason I didn't actually put it as a major point to look out for when getting a laptop, for these three main reasons. Now, for my personal laptop recommendations, I'll give you some laptops around $500, maybe high or low. And you should also take note that prices are relative to time, economic conditions, and other factors. So take note of that whenever you're putting a laptop in mind. For programmers, you can go with the current laptop I'm using, which is the HP EliteBook 840 G5, the HP EliteBook 840 G6, the Asus VivoBook 15-inch, the Acer Aspire 5 15-inch, the Asus VivoBook 16-inch, the MacBook Air M1, and if you have money, you can go for the M2 MacBook Air. For video editing and graphics designing, the Asus ZenBook 15-inch, the Asus ZenBook Pro 15-inch, the Dell XPS 15, the Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Carbon, the M1 MacBook Air for light video editing, and the M2 MacBook Air as well. But if you're going to be doing heavy intensive work on a MacBook, you should consider the MacBook with the Pro chips, like the M1 MacBook Pro, the M2 MacBook Pro, or the M1 MacBook, or the M-Mac. Oh, shit. These names are confusing. But if you're going to be doing graphics intensive work or video editing on a MacBook, you should consider the Pro chips on the Pro model of MacBooks. So if you have your own personal recommendations for laptops for programming, video editing, and graphics designing, please leave them down in the comment section. And if I forgot to mention anything, also tell me down there as well. That is it. That is my guide on purchasing a laptop for programming, graphics designing, and video editing. I hope you found this video interesting. If you want to watch my honest take on how the HP EliteBook 840 G5 has held up in these three categories as we're entering into 2025, drop a comment, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss that video. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, it's T4Tech. Peace.